Mary Virginia Garr was the youngest sister to Abel Garr. Abel was Phyllis's grandfather. Mary married Nathaniel Ashby and had 10 children. Mary was the youngest of the Garr girls. She was only 4 years old when her mother died at the age of 39 years in Nauvoo in 1844. Her mother, Pauline Turner Garr, had heard the gospel from Joseph Smith in her Indiana home as he traveled to or from Kirtland. It was along the path to Kirtland. Before she died, she had her husband Fielding Garr promise that he would take the family to Salt Lake. Fielding never remarried. He took his entire family across the plain except for his oldest daughter Eliza, who was married. Eliza was not a member of the church and, having an infant, moved back to Indiana where her other relatives lived. Fielding's next oldest daughter was Nancy. She was married to Rodney Badger. They also traveled with the Fieldings across the plains to Salt Lake Valley. So Fielding was going with his family and Rodney, who was his son-in-law. It's interesting that Fielding was the only one that was baptized before they crossed the plains. None of his children had been baptized. And it's also of interest that none of the boys entered into plural marriage once they got to Utah, but all the girls, once they got to Utah, ended up in a plural marriage. Now, Mary Virginia was 7 years old when they arrived in Salt Lake City. She lived on Antelope Island until she was 15 years old. With no school on the island, she had no formal education while she lived on Antelope Island. It was on Antelope Island where she met her husband, Nathaniel Ashby. Nathaniel's dad, Nathaniel Ashby Sr., died in Iowa in September 1846. His mother, Susan, remarried in February 1847 to Joseph Bates Noble in winter quarters. At the time of the marriage, Joseph had 2 other wives and 3 children living. Susan, when remarried, had 11 children, the oldest being 18. Now Joseph had 3 wives and 14 children to take across the plains. Joseph Noble went with the 3rd Company to Utah in 1947. He was in the same company as the Garr family. He made arrangements for the Ashby family to follow later due to the number of children in the group. The Ashbys left in the early summer of the following year, 1848, having just 1 wagon, 3 oxen, and 2 cows. They journeyed in Brigham Young's company, arriving in September 1848. Nathaniel was only 13 years old when he went with his family, and he drove a team for Father Havens, who was in the same company. Soon after the pioneers arrived in Salt Lake Valley, Joseph Noble, Fielding Garr, and Brother Thurston took a ranch on Antelope Island. Stock belonging to the church, as well as Brigham Young's private herd, were taken there, and finally Fielding Garr was given responsibility for them. Nathaniel's mother, Susan, died 4 years after her marriage to Joseph Noble in May 1851 in Salt Lake City, leaving 11 orphaned children plus 1 child that was the daughter of Joseph Noble. The children were left in the care of Briant Stringham, who had married Suzanne Ashby the year before the death of Susan. Briant had worked with cattle on Antelope Island. The Ashby boys were employed by the church to care for the stock, driving cattle over there to the island, etc., and they were soon known as the best horsemen around. Fielding Garr and his family lived on Antelope Island, and it is evident that it wasn't easy for Nat to meet his bride, Mary Virginia Garr, an 18-year-old immigrant from Wayne County, Indiana. They married on February 11, 1858, and made their home in Salt Lake and also on Antelope Island, where they lived. There was a lot of courting of the Ashbys going on Antelope Island. I created a chart so it was easy to make it easier to follow. So Briant Stringham, one of the hands on Antelope Island, married 3 of the sisters. Susan Ashby in 1850, Harriet in 1852, and Martha in 1856. Shortly after that, Nathaniel Ashby married Mary Virginia, and Briant married Mary's sister's Nancy Maria Garr Badger. So Briant Stringham married to 3 Ashbys plus Maria Virginia's sister, Nancy. Nathaniel's brother, William, married 2 of Nancy Maria Garr's daughters. He married Nancy in 1865 and Charlotte in 1876. And in 1877, Nancy's son, Rodney Carlos, married Louisa Noble, the half-sister to Nathaniel. So she was the only one that was born of Joseph Noble, and that was married by Rodney Carlos, who was the son of Mary Virginia's sister, Nancy. As you can see, Mary Virginia had a lot of common relations with her sister Nancy, who was 18 years older than Mary. In 1861, after being married 3 years, Nathaniel and Mary were called on a colonization mission to southern Utah and were some of the founding settlers of St. George. In 1869, Nathaniel was called as the second bishop of the St. George ward, succeeding Bishop Robert Gardner. Nathan and his sons were in the cattle raising business. Mary and Nathaniel had 10 children, 5 girls and 5 boys. Most were born in St. George. The older ones were born in Salt Lake City. On August 11, 1870, Nathaniel was married to Martha Ann Truman, a second wife, in the endowment house in Salt Lake City. This was 12 years after he married Mary. Nathaniel lived in plural marriage with the 2 wives until his death. Martha and Nathaniel had 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls, so a total of 16 children altogether. Because of his failing health, he was called on a mission to the Sandwich Island. It was thought that the warm climate would help him recover, so on December 13, 1881, Nathaniel was set apart as a missionary to the Sandwich Islands by John Taylor, George Cannon, and George F. Smith. He took his second wife, Martha, with him, probably because Mary had just had a baby and was not fit to travel to the islands. And he took Benjamin Franklin, which was Mary's son. His health did not improve, and he decided to return home in 1882. However, he died of consumption on March 19, 1882, en route from Honolulu to San Francisco at sea, just a day and a half away from San Francisco. Mary Virginia passed away 4 years after him in April 1886. At that time, her oldest daughter, Mary Virginia Ashby, was married and pregnant with her 3rd child. Her next oldest daughter, Mary, took care of the youngest children, and her oldest daughter, Mary, took in the youngest children left, that were left orphaned, and the next oldest daughter, Louisa, kept house for the rest of the family. So soon afterwards, the home was sold, and they all worked at whatever jobs they could find. And that ends this.